Have you ever wondered if love can truly break through the chains of duty and tradition? Have you ever questioned whether a heart can choose its own path when the entire world demands obedience? Today I want to share with you a story that will make your heart race and question everything you thought you knew about destiny, honor, and the price of true love. This is a tale of a prince bound by the iron chains of duty, a beggar bride hiding an impossible secret that could shake kingdoms, and a choice that would transform not just two lives but the very foundations of an entire realm. Stay with me, because what begins as the deepest humiliation transforms into the most dangerous and beautiful kind of love. Can love truly conquer the crushing weight of a crown? Can two souls find each other across an abyss of class and expectation? Let us discover together, because this journey will take us from the cold stones of shame to the warmest chambers of the human heart. In the heart of a prosperous English kingdom, where ancient stone castles rose against perpetually gray skies and colorful banners fluttered in the cold northern wind, where the echoes of knights and the whispers of court intrigue filled every corridor, the crown prince was known throughout the entire land for his iron discipline and his unwavering adherence to the sacred traditions that had governed his family for countless generations. From the moment he drew his first breath in the royal birthing chamber, his path had been carved in unyielding stone by hands other than his own. A political marriage to a neighboring princess, alliances carefully forged through sacred vows and binding treaties, a future mapped with precision between council chambers and throne rooms. His life belonged not to himself, but to the realm, to duty above all else, to the endless crushing weight of expectations that pressed upon his shoulders like armor he could never remove, not even in sleep. Every step he took was measured, every word he spoke was calculated, every smile he offered was practiced before mirrors until it appeared genuine. He was the perfect prince, the ideal heir, a man who had sacrificed his own desires so completely that he had forgotten he ever possessed them. Yet fate, as it often does with those who believe themselves to be masters of their own carefully controlled destinies, had other plans entirely for this prince who had never known freedom. It happened during a magnificent feast in the Great Hall, one of those lavish celebrations that the nobility loved to indulge in, where wine flowed as freely as the river outside the castle walls and nobles competed endlessly in elaborate displays of wealth, power, and bravado. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meats, the sound of laughter and music, the glitter of jewels catching torchlight. In such an atmosphere, caution tends to fade and boldness rises like steam from the kitchens below. The prince, emboldened by the cheers of his companions and perhaps by the wine that had loosened the tight control he always maintained over himself, found himself drawn into a contest of wagers among the young nobles. What started as harmless jest grew increasingly reckless as the night wore on. One particularly audacious lord, known for his sharp tongue and sharper wit, proposed a wager so outrageous that the entire table fell silent. The terms seemed absurd, impossible, the kind of bet that no one actually expected to lose. But the prince, his pride stung by the challenging looks of his peers and the whispered doubts about whether he possessed true courage beneath all that discipline, accepted without fully considering the consequences. The details of the wager itself have been lost to time and wine-soaked memories, but the outcome was crystal clear and utterly devastating. When dawn broke cold and gray over the castle battlements, when the wine had faded from his blood and clarity returned like a cruel awakening, the prince found himself bound by the most sacred law of nobility, his word given before witnesses. He had lost the bet, and the price demanded was unthinkable, unprecedented, a scandal that would reverberate through every corner of the kingdom and beyond. According to the terms he had foolishly agreed to, he must wed a beggar woman, someone pulled directly from the frozen, filthy streets of the city below, a creature without title, without dowry, without family, without any value whatsoever in the eyes of the glittering court that surrounded him. A woman who represented everything the nobility despised and feared: poverty, disorder, the failure of bloodlines to maintain their purity. The news spread like wildfire through every tapestried corridor and stone chamber of the castle. It leaped from servant to noble, from castle to village, from kingdom to neighboring realm. Ladies of the court whispered frantically behind their jeweled fans, their voices dripping with scandal and barely concealed delight at the misfortune of one who had always seemed so perfect. Knights laughed in their barracks, some in genuine amusement, others in the uncomfortable relief that comes from seeing someone else fall from grace. The nobility reacted with collective horror and indignation, their carefully constructed world of order and hierarchy suddenly threatened by this grotesque violation of everything they held sacred. How could the heir to the throne, a man destined by blood and divine right to rule over them all, be shackled to such a wretched, impossible match? It was an offense against nature itself, against the very foundations of civilization. The king, a stern man whose face had been carved by decades of difficult decisions, summoned his son to the private royal chambers with a fury that was all the more terrifying for being barely contained behind his weathered, controlled features. The confrontation lasted hours, voices rising and falling like waves against cliffs. The king demanded the wager be broken, declared it null and void, insisted that honor meant nothing when measured against the stability of the realm and the purity of the royal bloodline. He offered solutions: gold to silence the witnesses, positions to buy their complicity, even darker methods if necessary. But the prince, shaped and hardened by the very codes and principles his father had drilled into him since childhood, refused to bend. A promise made before witnesses, he insisted with a stubbornness that bordered on madness, could not be unmade simply because it had become inconvenient. If he broke his word now, what value would any future oath hold? How could he demand loyalty if he himself proved faithless? The argument that honor mattered above all else was turned back upon the very man who had taught it. The king raged, but ultimately, bitter and defeated, he recognized that his son was right according to the laws they both served. The marriage would proceed, and with it would come shame unlike any the kingdom had known. The bride was brought to the castle on a gray morning when frost still clung to the cobblestones and breath hung visible in the cold air. She arrived not in a carriage but on foot, escorted by guards who looked upon her with a mixture of pity and disgust. Her clothes were torn and muddy, barely fit to be called garments at all, more like rags held together by desperation and dirt. Her hair was tangled and unwashed, her hands rough and scarred from years of survival on merciless streets. But it was her eyes that caught attention, those who dared to look directly at her face. They were not the empty, defeated eyes one might expect from someone in her position. Instead, they held something else entirely: distrust certainly, defiance absolutely, but also a strange, inexplicable dignity that should not exist in someone the world had so thoroughly discarded and forgotten. She stood in the grand cathedral like a wild creature suddenly trapped in a golden cage, surrounded on all sides by nobles dressed in their finest silks and velvets, their jewels catching the light streaming through stained glass windows depicting saints and angels. The contrast was almost obscene. She was dirt and survival standing in a temple of wealth and power. The assembled court looked upon her with barely concealed contempt, some unable to hide their expressions of disgust, others smirking behind their hands at what they perceived as the greatest joke ever played upon the crown. Children of noble families pointed and whispered until their parents hushed them, though the parents themselves could not stop staring. The prince stood at the altar in his ceremonial robes, every inch the perfect royal heir despite the circumstances that had brought him to this moment. He maintained his composure with practiced ease, his face revealing nothing of the turmoil surely raging beneath that carefully constructed exterior. When the moment came to speak his vows, his voice did not waver or crack. Each word was pronounced clearly, echoing through the vast cathedral space. The ceremony was a mockery, everyone present knew this. A spectacle that would be remembered and retold for generations as the day the crown fell into the gutter, the day nobility itself was soiled. Yet as the prince glanced at the woman beside him, something flickered in his awareness, something small and unexpected that he could not yet name or understand. Her eyes, though wary and guarded, held that strange dignity he had noticed before, a strength that defied all logic and reason. Who was this woman truly? The question planted itself in his mind like a seed, small but persistent. The wedding night arrived with all its inherent awkwardness and tension multiplied 1,000-fold by the bizarre circumstances. The prince entered the royal bedchamber expecting nothing beyond the formality of appearance, prepared to maintain distance and dignity in this forced arrangement that neither of them had chosen. The room was prepared as it always was for such occasions, candles burning, wine waiting, the great bed with its heavy curtains. But the atmosphere was completely wrong, filled not with anticipation but with discomfort and unspoken questions. When they were finally alone, truly alone for the first time, away from all the prying eyes and malicious whispers that had followed them like shadows throughout the day, something unexpected happened. The silence between them was heavy, but not entirely hostile. They were two prisoners examining the cell they would now share, two strangers bound together by forces neither controlled. The prince, educated in diplomacy and trained to read people, attempted conversation. His tone was formal but not unkind. He assured her that he would not demand anything of her beyond appearances, that she would be provided for, that her life would certainly be better than it had been on the streets, even if this arrangement was not what either of them would have chosen. He expected gratitude or fear, or perhaps the sullen silence of someone overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their comprehension. What he received instead was something entirely different. The beggar woman looked at him directly, meeting his eyes in a way that no one of her supposed station should dare, and when she spoke, her words were not those of a street urchin grateful for crumbs. Her language was refined, her thoughts organized, her manner of expression suggesting education that should not exist in someone who had been pulled from the gutters. Through halting confessions that came slowly, painfully, like drawing poison from a wound, through tears she had fought to hold back for years and could no longer contain, the prince learned the truth that would change everything. She was not truly a beggar, not born to the streets and poverty. She was the last living descendant of a forgotten royal line, a family erased from history by the brutal games of power that ruled kingdoms and destroyed anyone who stood in the way of ambition. Her bloodline had been ancient and proud. Her family once held lands and titles that rivaled the current ruling house. But in the violent upheavals that had rocked the kingdom decades ago, before either of them were born, her family had been systematically hunted down and destroyed. Land seized, titles stripped, family members killed or disappeared in the night. She had survived only because she had been a small child, overlooked in the chaos, hidden by a loyal servant who died protecting her secret. She had grown up in the shadows, moving from one hiding place to another, learning to disappear into the masses of poor and forgotten people who filled every city. She had survived by becoming invisible, by learning the skills of the street, by burying everything she had once been beneath layers of dirt and desperation. No one would think to look for lost royalty among the beggars and thieves. It was the perfect hiding place, and it had kept her alive when nothing else could. But it had also cost her everything. Her name, her heritage, her very identity. She had become the disguise she wore until she could barely remember the child she had once been, sleeping in soft beds and learning to read from leather-bound books. The revelation shook the prince to his very core, cracking the foundations of everything he thought he understood about the situation. This changed everything, and yet, in the eyes of the court and the kingdom, it changed nothing at all. She was still the woman they all despised, still the bride who had brought unprecedented shame upon his house and his name. Her secret heritage meant nothing if it could not be proven, and even if it could be proven, it might only make things worse by raising questions about succession and legitimacy that the current ruling family would never tolerate. But to the prince personally, privately, in the quiet of that chamber with only candles as witnesses, it meant something profound. She was not a beggar who had stumbled into fortune. She was a survivor who had endured what would have broken most people. She was, in her own way, as much a prisoner of fate and duty as he had always been. And perhaps most dangerous of all to his carefully ordered world, she was becoming fascinating to him in ways that defied all logic and training. Over the following days and weeks, as the court continued its relentless whispered campaigns to annul the marriage and restore proper order to the disrupted hierarchy, as advisors plotted and nobles schemed and foreign ambassadors sent carefully worded messages questioning the stability of the realm, the prince found himself drawn to his unlikely wife in ways that surprised and disturbed him. He began to seek out her company, at first telling himself it was merely curiosity or perhaps pity, but gradually admitting that it was something else entirely. Their conversations began cautiously, two prisoners circling each other warily in the same cell, neither entirely trusting the other, but both recognizing that they were trapped together and might as well make the best of it. She told him stories of her childhood, not the poverty and fear of her later years, but the golden memories from before the fall. She described hidden chambers and forgotten castles, lessons in history and philosophy from tutors now long dead, the feeling of safety that had been ripped away in a single night of blood and fire. She told him of watching her family fall one by one, of the servant who had carried her to safety, of learning to pick pockets and sleep in doorways to survive, of the constant fear of being discovered and eliminated like all the others. She spoke of hunger not just for food, but for purpose, for identity, for the right to exist as herself rather than as a shadow. Her words painted pictures of a life he could never have imagined, a world existing just beneath the one he knew, where survival was victory and tomorrow was never guaranteed. He shared, for the first time in his entire carefully controlled life, the suffocating weight of being born to rule. He confessed the loneliness of never having true friends, only allies and sycophants. He admitted the exhaustion of wearing a crown before he had ever worn a genuine smile, of every action being watched and judged, of never being permitted to fail or falter or simply be human. He revealed the emptiness of duty without desire, of following a path carved by others without ever questioning whether it was the path he would have chosen for himself. For the first time, he spoke about the prison of privilege, and she understood because she had lost privilege and knew its true value. They discovered in each other something neither had known they were missing until that moment. Genuine understanding born not from similarity, but from complementary experiences of powerlessness. The walls between them, built of class and circumstance and the expectations of an entire watching kingdom, began to crumble like ancient mortar exposed to wind and rain. What started as curiosity became respect. Respect became companionship. And companionship, in the quiet hours stolen between official duties and court appearances, in walks through gardens where she moved among roses despite the disapproving glares of servants, in late-night conversations by candlelight when the rest of the castle slept, became something far more dangerous than either had anticipated. It became friendship, and friendship became attraction. And attraction was blossoming into something that had no name but felt like falling and flying simultaneously. The prince found himself counting the hours between their meetings, found his thoughts drifting to her during tedious council sessions, found himself defending her to nobles who dared speak against her in his presence. He noticed everything about her, the grace in her movements despite years of hardship, the intelligence that flashed in her eyes when she debated philosophy and strategy with him, the courage it must have taken not just to survive all those years alone, but to retain any humanity or hope in the face of such loss. He saw her learning the ways of the court with determination, saw her refusing to be broken by the cruelty of those who looked down upon her, saw her maintaining that inexplicable dignity that had caught his attention from the very first moment. She, in turn, saw past the arrogant air that the world knew and sometimes feared. She discovered a man trapped by duty, shaped and sometimes twisted by impossible expectations, yet possessing a core of genuine honor that had driven him to keep an absurd promise even at the cost of his reputation and future. She saw the loneliness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, the brief moments when his careful mask slipped and revealed the man beneath the prince. She recognized in him a kindred spirit, another prisoner in a different kind of cell. And that recognition sparked something she had thought dead within her: hope. Not hope for rescue or restoration of her heritage, but something simpler and more profound. Hope that perhaps, despite everything, despite the impossible circumstances that had brought them together, she might not have to face the rest of her life alone. The attraction grew like vines climbing castle walls, impossible to stop once it started, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Stolen glances across crowded rooms, hands that brushed accidentally and then not so accidentally, conversations that stretched long into the night, covering every topic from politics to poetry, the discovery of shared laughter over some small absurdity of court life, the comfort of comfortable silence, which is perhaps the truest sign of real connection. They were falling, both of them knew it, and neither knew how to stop or whether they even wanted to. Have you ever felt your heart betray everything you thought you believed? Have you ever fallen for someone the world told you was forbidden, wrong, impossible? Have you ever stood at the edge of a choice knowing that either direction would cost you something precious? Share your story in the comments below, because I promise you, what happens next will show you that the greatest battles in life are fought not with swords and shields, but with hearts that refuse to obey the commands of duty and tradition. But the court, of course, would not be ignored or denied. The nobility had not survived centuries of political maneuvering by accepting change gracefully. Advisors pressed the king daily to end this farce before it caused permanent damage to the crown's reputation. Foreign ambassadors whispered their concerns about the stability of alliances, about whether a kingdom that could not control its own heir could be trusted as a reliable partner. Noble families who had offered their daughters for consideration withdrew both their daughters and their support from the crown, aligning themselves with factions that promised more predictable outcomes. The pressure mounted day by day like storm clouds gathering over the battlements, dark and heavy and promising violence. Then came the announcement of the grand banquet, an event arranged specifically to display the kingdom's continued power and stability to visiting dignitaries and representatives from neighboring realms. Every eye in the civilized world would be watching, judging, calculating. Every tongue would be ready to spread whatever transpired across the entire continent. The prince knew exactly what was expected of him, what had been carefully planned and orchestrated by advisors and his father. He was to announce the annulment, to publicly cast aside his beggar bride and restore proper order to the natural hierarchy. The documents had already been prepared by the finest legal scholars, justifications crafted from obscure points of law and tradition. All he needed to do was speak the words, sign the papers, and his path would be clear once more. He could resume his intended marriage alliance, repair the damage to his reputation, return to being the perfect heir everyone expected and needed him to be. His father's eyes bore into him from the high table with the weight of generations of kings. His mother looked away, unable to watch what she believed would be either her son's humiliation made permanent or his shameful capitulation to pressure. The great hall was filled to capacity with nobles dressed in their finest, with foreign dignitaries watching with diplomatic neutrality that barely concealed their intense interest, with servants moving through the crowds bearing platters of food and goblets of wine. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Everyone knew something significant was about to happen. The hall fell into absolute silence as the prince slowly rose to speak, every eye fixed upon him, waiting. But before he could open his mouth to deliver the carefully prepared statement, before he could set in motion the annulment that would free him from the beggar bride and return his life to its intended course, something unexpected happened that would change the trajectory of everything. A messenger burst through the great doors of the hall, his clothes dusty from hard riding, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. He carried a leather document case bearing seals that made the older nobles gasp in recognition, seals they had thought never to see again in this lifetime. Evidence, concrete and undeniable, brought from distant archives where old records had been carefully preserved by those who believe that truth matters even when power tries to bury it. Proof of the bride's true lineage. Documents that established beyond any doubt that she was not merely of royal blood, but potentially possessed a claim to lands and titles that predated the current ruling family itself. The hall erupted in chaos unlike anything it had witnessed in decades. Nobles shouted, some in outrage at this disruption, others in excitement at the scandal unfolding before them. Advisors scrambled, rushing to examine the documents, to verify their authenticity, to understand the implications. The king rose from his seat, his face a mask of shock and barely controlled fury. And in the center of it all, like the eye of a hurricane, the beggar bride stood with her head held high for the first time since entering the castle, no longer apologizing for existing, no longer shrinking from the contempt of those around her. She stood as her ancestors would have stood, with the bearing of someone who had finally remembered who she truly was beneath all the layers of survival and hiding. The prince looked at her across the sea of shocked and arguing faces, across the impossible distance that separated them physically in that crowded hall, and he understood with perfect crystal clarity what this moment meant. He understood all the options that now lay before him like paths diverging in a forest. He could use this revelation politically, legitimize their marriage through her proven bloodline, and save face before the entire kingdom. He could claim that he had always known that the marriage had been strategic rather than shameful. He could turn disaster into triumph simply by reshaping the narrative. The court would accept it, eventually. His reputation would be restored. His father might even be pleased at the unexpected acquisition of a valuable alliance. It was the perfect solution, handed to him by fate just when he needed it most. Or he could do something far more radical, far more dangerous, far more honest. He could choose her not because of her secret lineage, not because it was now convenient or politically advantageous, not because it would save his reputation or strengthen his position. He could choose her simply because somewhere between the mockery of their wedding and this moment of revelation, between their first wary conversations and their last lingering glance, he had fallen hopelessly, irrevocably, completely in love with the woman who had survived impossible odds and still managed to retain her humanity. He could choose her because she had taught him what it meant to be free, to be honest, to be fully human rather than just a perfect prince. He could choose love over duty for the first time in his entire carefully controlled life. The silence that had fallen over the hall was absolute, heavy with expectation and fear. Every breath seemed suspended, every heartbeat loud in the terrible quiet. The prince stood frozen for a moment that stretched like eternity, caught between two worlds, two futures, two versions of himself. He could feel the weight of his father's expectations pressing down on him like physical force, could sense his mother's anxiety radiating across the space between them, could practically hear the calculations running through the minds of every noble and advisor present. They all believed they knew what would happen next. They had already written the ending to the story in their minds, confident that duty and tradition would win as they always did, as they must if the world was to continue functioning as it should. But in that suspended moment, the prince's eyes found hers across the chaos of the hall, and something passed between them that no one else could see or understand. It was recognition, acceptance, and a question all at once. In her gaze he saw his own reflection, not the perfect prince everyone expected, but the man he had been becoming in their stolen moments together, the person he might be if he had the courage to choose. She was not asking him to choose her, he realized. She had never asked for anything. She was simply standing there, finally revealed in her true identity, giving him permission to do whatever he must do to survive, to thrive, to fulfill his destiny. She would understand either way. That realization, that unconditional acceptance, was what broke something open inside him that had been locked and sealed since childhood. The prince walked forward through the crowd, nobles parting before him like water before a ship's prow. some moving aside eagerly to see what would happen, others reluctantly making space while radiating disapproval. He could feel their eyes on him like brands, burning with judgment and anticipation. He could hear whispered comments, barely audible speculations about what he would say, how he would handle this unexpected complication. Some were already planning how to use this revelation to their advantage, how to position themselves favorably with a bride who suddenly had legitimate royal blood. Others were calculating the damage control needed, the alliances that would have to be rebuilt, the explanations that would satisfy foreign courts. None of them, not a single soul in that vast hall, understood what was actually about to happen. He walked to her, to the woman who had been brought to him as punishment and become his salvation, who had entered his life as a symbol of shame and transformed into the first genuine connection he had ever known. She stood perfectly still, her newfound dignity wrapped around her like armor, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands, could read the uncertainty in her eyes despite her brave facade. She was terrified, he realized, not of him but of hope itself. She had learned long ago not to hope for anything beyond survival, and now suddenly hope was being dangled before her like a torch in darkness, beautiful and dangerous and likely to be snatched away at any moment. He understood that fear intimately because he felt it too, the terror of reaching for something real when you have spent your entire life accepting substitutes and shadows. He took her hand in his before the entire assembled court, before his father and mother, before foreign ambassadors and scheming nobles, before everyone whose opinion had always mattered so much, whose approval he had spent his entire life seeking and maintaining. Her hand was cold in his, trembling slightly, marked by years of hard survival in ways that no lady of the court would ever understand. He held it gently but firmly, as one might hold something precious and fragile, something that could shatter if handled carelessly, but was worth more than all the treasures in the kingdom's vaults. And then he spoke, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the vast hall, cutting through the whispers and speculation like a sword through silk. He did not speak of her lineage or political advantage, though those words would have been easier, safer, more acceptable to the assembled crowd. Instead, he spoke of honor, but not the hollow honor of keeping promises made in drunken foolishness, not the performative honor that nobles wore like decorative armor in safe spaces far from real danger. He spoke of the true honor that comes from acknowledging truth even when it is inconvenient or costly, from choosing love even when the world demands duty and sacrifice, from becoming the person you are meant to be rather than forever playing the role others insist you must perform. His words were not rehearsed or calculated, they came from somewhere deep within, from a place he had not known existed until she had helped him discover it. He told the assembled court that he had entered this marriage as punishment, bound by a foolish wager and stubborn pride, expecting nothing but obligation and endurance. He admitted his own arrogance, his assumption that someone born to the streets could have nothing to teach a prince, could offer nothing of value beyond the fulfillment of an oath. He confessed that he had been wrong in ways that shamed him now, wrong about so much that he had taken for granted as absolute truth. Then his voice changed, softened, became something more intimate despite the hundreds of people listening to every word. He spoke of discovering in his unlikely bride a wisdom born from survival, a courage born from loss, a humanity that his privileged existence had nearly crushed out of him. He described how she had shown him what it meant to be truly alive rather than simply existing within predetermined boundaries, how her presence had awakened parts of himself he had not known were sleeping. He spoke of late-night conversations that had meant more to him than all the state councils he had attended, of laughter shared over small absurdities that had brought more joy than any royal celebration, of the comfort he had found in simply being seen and accepted as himself rather than as the crown prince, with all its associated duties and expectations. He described how she had taught him that there were forms of nobility that had nothing to do with bloodlines or titles, that true strength sometimes looked like vulnerability, that the greatest courage was not found on battlefields but in the daily choice to Remain human and hopeful in the face of a world that tried to break you into useful shapes. His words painted a picture not of a prince condescending to save a beggar, but of two people who had saved each other from the different prisons they inhabited. Then, his voice growing stronger, more certain, he addressed the revelation of her lineage directly. He acknowledged that she was indeed of royal blood, that the documents proved her claim to nobility was as legitimate as anyone's in that hall, perhaps more so given the antiquity of her family line. He could see some nobles nodding, already adjusting their calculations, already planning how to approach her now that she was revealed as one of them after all. But then he said something that sent shockwaves through the assembly more profound than the initial revelation had done. He declared that her bloodline, while factually important and historically significant, was not why he was making the choice he was about to make. It was not the reason he loved her, not the justification for his decision, not the thing that made her worthy in his eyes. She had been worthy all along, he insisted, even when they all believed her to be nothing but a beggar, even when she had no proof of heritage or claim to status. Her worth had never been dependent on documents or bloodlines or the approval of courts and councils. Then came the declaration that would echo through history and be debated in courts and taverns for generations to come. The prince, standing tall and unwavering despite the magnitude of what he was about to do, renounced his claim to the throne. The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward in waves. He declared that no crown was worth wearing if it meant living a lie, if it meant sacrificing the only genuine love he had ever known, if it meant becoming the kind of ruler who valued appearances over authenticity and power over truth. He explained that he had spent his entire life preparing to be king, but in doing so he had forgotten to learn how to be human, and she had taught him that humanity mattered more than sovereignty. A king without humanity, he argued, was just a tyrant with better clothes and a fancier title. His father made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a roar, rising from his seat as if physically struck. His mother covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face, though whether from grief or understanding or some mixture of both, no one could say. The assembled nobles erupted into chaos once more, some shouting in outrage at this abandonment of duty, others arguing about the implications for succession, still others silent in shock at witnessing something they had never imagined possible. Foreign ambassadors whispered frantically to their scribes, ensuring every word would be recorded and reported back to their own courts. This was the kind of scandal that would reshape diplomatic relationships for decades. But the prince was not finished. He turned to face his bride fully now, no longer addressing the court but speaking directly to her as if they were alone in that vast crowded space. He asked her, before all these witnesses who could never unsee or unhear what was transpiring, not as a prince seeking a political alliance, but as a man seeking a partner to walk beside him whatever difficult and uncertain path might lay ahead. He asked if she would have him not as an obligation or a duty, but as a choice freely made, if she would build a life with him outside these walls, away from crowns and courts and all the trappings of power that had proven to be golden cages rather than prizes worth winning. He promised her nothing but himself, no titles or wealth or security, only his love and his commitment and his determination to face whatever came next together rather than alone. The silence that followed his words was absolute and seemed to stretch for an eternity, the entire assembly holding its collective breath. Every eye was on her now, the revealed princess who was still dressed in the simple clothes of her beggar disguise, the woman who had survived impossible loss and was now being offered an impossible choice. She could accept her heritage, claim her rightful place among the nobility, use the documents that proved her bloodline to establish herself within the very structure that had destroyed her family. The court would accept her now, might even celebrate her, would certainly treat her with the respect due to her rank. She could have everything she had lost as a child: safety, comfort, status, belonging. All she had to do was let him go, accept his sacrifice as the noble gesture it was, and build a new life from the ruins of the old. It was the practical choice, the sensible choice, the choice that any reasonable person would make. Or she could choose him, choose love over security, choose partnership over position, choose the terrifying freedom of an uncertain future over the comfortable prison of restored nobility. She could walk away from everything twice, first when her family was destroyed and now again when it was being offered back to her. The choice was entirely hers, and everyone in that hall knew it, felt the weight of it, understood that this moment would define not just two lives, but would become a story told and retold, a legend that would carry meaning far beyond the individuals involved. She looked at him for a long moment, this prince who had started as her reluctant husband and become the first person in years to truly see her, to value her for herself rather than for what she represented or what she could provide. She saw in his eyes the same fear and hope she felt churning in her own heart, the same terrified understanding that they were standing on the edge of something vast and irreversible. Then she smiled, and it was not the careful, guarded expression she had worn since entering the castle, but something genuine and radiant that transformed her entire face, revealing the woman she might have been if life had been kinder, the woman she might still become if she was brave enough to reach for it. She spoke then, her voice clear despite the trembling in her hands, loud enough for at least those nearby to hear, though not projecting to the entire hall as his had done. She told him yes, simply and directly, with no elaborate speeches or dramatic declarations. Yes, she would choose him. Yes, she would walk whatever path they must walk together. Yes, she was willing to gamble everything on the possibility of genuine love and authentic life, even though she had learned the hard way that such gambles often ended in loss and grief. But she had also learned, she said, that the only thing worse than risking your heart was never risking it at all, never knowing what might have been possible if you had been brave enough to try. Her family had been destroyed by those who chose power over humanity, and she would not dishonor their memory by making the same choice now. She would choose love, choose him, choose the possibility of happiness over the certainty of mere survival. The silence that followed broke not with the sound of his father's goblet crashing to the floor, but with something quieter and somehow more profound. It was the sound of his mother weeping, not in grief now, but in something that might have been relief or recognition, or perhaps the complicated joy that comes from watching someone you love choose their own path even when it breaks your heart. The king remained standing, his face a mask of emotions too complex to read, struggling between rage at the disruption of his carefully laid plans and something that might have been understanding or even respect for the courage it took to make such a choice. The nobles continued their chaos of whispers and arguments, but it no longer mattered what they thought or said, because the decision had been made and witnessed and could not be unmade by any amount of political maneuvering. They left the castle that very night, not as prince and beggar, but as two people who had discovered that the greatest treasure in life is not found in throne rooms or treasure vaults, but in hearts brave enough to love beyond all the chains of destiny and duty. Some say they built a simple life in a distant village where no one knew their names or cared about their past, where they could simply be themselves without the weight of crowns or the burden of history. Others whisper they sailed to foreign lands across dangerous seas where they could start completely anew, where old scandals could not follow. But everyone who heard their story, who spread it from kingdom to kingdom until it became legend, understood the profound lesson it carried like a precious jewel. True nobility is not measured by blood or title or the accidents of birth, but by the courage to choose love and truth when the entire world demands that you choose power and lies instead. The kingdom eventually healed from the scandal, as kingdoms always do, finding new crises and concerns to occupy its endless appetite for drama. Another heir was named from among the relatives, alliances were reformed through different marriages, and life continued its inexorable forward march as it always does, regardless of individual stories. But in taverns where common people gathered, around hearth fires where families told stories on long winter nights, in the songs of wandering minstrels and the whispered tales of romantic souls, People still speak of the prince who gave up everything for a beggar bride who was so much more than she appeared. They tell it not as a tragedy, but as a victory, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of love, but as an inspiration about the courage required to be truly free. They tell it as a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit that their heart knows truths their mind cannot explain or justify. If this story has touched your heart, if it has made you believe even for a moment that love can indeed break through any barrier that society erects, that true connection matters more than all the crowns and titles in the world, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel and join our community of believers in love's transforming power. Every single week, I bring you new tales of forbidden love, of hearts that dared to defy convention and expectation, of those precious moments when passion conquered duty and authenticity triumphed over appearances. Because these stories matter more than mere entertainment. They remind us that we are so much more than the role society assigns to us, more than the expectations others place upon our shoulders, more than the fear that keeps us trapped in lives we never chose. We are the choices we make when everything is on the line, when the easy path and the true path diverge, and we must decide who we really are. Join me on this journey through history and imagination, and together we will explore every shade and color of love that human hearts can create. Until next time, may you always have the courage to follow your heart wherever it leads, even into territories that maps cannot show and compasses cannot find.